So in this video, I'm going to talk about the three main types of verb questions that you'll encounter on the SAT or digital SAT, and how to recognize which kind of question you're dealing with and therefore get the right answer, because it's going to be hard to get the right answer if you don't know what they're asking. And so the first kind, these are in no particular order, but the first kind would be subject-verb agreement. And we're going to look at some examples in just a second. But subject-verb agreement, you're trying to figure out whether your verb agrees with the subject, primarily in number. Like if you have a plural subject, you need a plural verb. If you have a singular subject, you need a singular verb. Another kind of question will involve the verb tense and or aspect. So when we talk about tense, we mean past, present, future. And then the aspect would be things like progressive, aka continuous, or perfect, like past perfect, present perfect, future perfect, and other stuff like that. And then the third type of question would be what I'm just going to call the verb form. Maybe there's a better way to put it, but do we want a finite verb, meaning a kind of verb that can be conjugated, or a participle or infinitive, something like that. And this is going to have to do with, well, sentence structure and what kind of verb form you need to either avoid having a fragment or avoid having a run-on or some other kind of issue. So how can we tell that we're dealing with a question involving subject-verb agreement? Well, the most reliable indicator is going to be the pattern in the answer choices. Namely, you're going to have a mix of singular and plural verbs. And the way you can tell this is to basically apply what I'll call the it-they test. So looking at these verbs here, allow would pair with they, allows would pair with it, have allowed would pair with they, and are allowing would pair with they. And so this is the most typical structure in terms of the answer choices on subject-verb agreement questions. You're going to have three plurals and one singular, or three singulars and one plural. Usually, not always, but usually the odd one out, the one that's not like the other three, is going to be correct. And that's going to be the case here. So playing a wild card allows a player to change the color and take control of the game. And so we can also have it the other way around, where we've got a singular, a singular, a singular, and a plural. And that would be a sign that our plural is quite likely going to be correct. And we'll find that that's true here. The idea that the resources and opportunities determine the breakthroughs they are capable of achieving. I'll say more about this one in a separate video, but here just wanted to point out that pattern, very, very common, and a sign that you have a subject-verb agreement question. Now, you can tell that you have a verb tense question when you look down at the answer choices and notice that, first of all, you have a finite verb in each of the answer choices, but you don't have any issues with subject-verb agreement. Like in this case, all of these would potentially pair with it. I realized that had and suggested could also pair with they, but the point is, when you have a verb tense question, there's not going to be an issue with subject-verb agreement. Okay, so what does that mean? It means you have to pay attention to really the whole passage. You can't just get it based on the sentence with the blank. You have to pay attention to the whole passage and look for clues as to, what the verb tense should be. So in this case, they're talking about something from the 1930s, and it says that Julian Hill proposed doing this. In addition, he suggested doing that. So you want to keep the verb consistent unless there is some indication that it should change. And I'll talk more about that in the video on verb tense and a potential follow-up where I go into the past perfect and present perfect, when you might want to use those. And so this would be a little more challenging example, but if you look at this one again, we see the subject is right there, the blank is right there. Look at the answer choices. They are long observing, they will long be observing, they have long observed, they long observe. Okay, so no subject-verb agreement issues. They all contain finite verbs, specifically in those, and so we have to pay attention to clues regarding what our verb tense or aspect should be. And I will talk about this one in more detail in a separate video, so I don't want to spoil that here. Now, as for verb form questions, what you're going to find in the answer choices is a mix of finite and non-finite verbs. And again, I'll talk about this distinction more in a separate video, but just as a brief introduction or reintroduction, as the case may be, a finite verb is one that has a number and a tense. So these are the only verbs, the only types of verbs that it makes sense to even apply the it, they test to, right? They have studied, it has studied. That's a little bit weird to say it has studied, but you get the point. It varies based on the nature of the subject, whether it's singular, plural, etc. So that's a finite verb, and I'm specifically underlining have because that's the finite verb in that pair. With the others, to study, that's the infinitive, non-finite. There's a connection there. So I'll just put NF. The participle, present participle, studying, that's non-finite, and having studied, so specifically that one. Those are non-finite verbs. They're not going to vary with the subject. You don't have a different form of to study for a singular versus a plural. Okay, so you can have multiple non-finite verbs in a sentence, but you have to have a finite verb. That's the thing that makes it a sentence, right? A pairing of a subject and a finite verb. And so for centuries, astronomers blank the constellations to map the night sky and navigate across vast oceans. Well, we definitely need a main verb here, and so that's going to be our correct answer. None of the remaining options, being non-finite verbs, will do the trick in terms of giving us a complete sentence. And so this distribution of answer choices, 3 that are one way and 1 that's the other way, that's pretty common on these questions. I have seen them vary it, so we don't want to just automatically pick the odd one out, but it can be a useful strategy. Really, the more important thing, though, is if you see this mix of finite and non-finite, that tells you that verb form, not subject-verb agreement and not verb tense, verb form is going to be the main thing. And so that can be a really helpful clue when you get a more complex sentence like this one and look at this and see, okay, this argument claimed, this argument has claimed, this argument claims, those all seem to agree with our subject. How could we possibly choose between those? This is another one that I'll talk about more in a separate video. I'll just note here that we have a finite verb here. That one contains a finite verb. That's a finite verb. Claiming is not a finite verb. And so that's a clue that maybe we want to give that one a good hard look and see if it works. Because if we look at the others, this argument claimed, this argument claims, this argument has claimed, it's kind of hard to tell which of those would work. They all agree in terms of number, so maybe that's a sign that maybe none of those are right, and we need to take a long hard look at C, because that could be exactly what we need. And so again, I'll talk about this one more in a separate video, but the important thing for this video is that most verb questions fall into one of these 3 categories, meaning that they are primarily testing one of these 3 things and not some mix. Now, having said that, I'll just offer a brief word of caution and note that it's certainly possible that they'll start mixing these issues together. They did that on the previous form of the SAT, and this question is meant to reflect that kind of thing where they're potentially mixing these issues together. We've got the infinitive and the participle, so 2 that are non-finite. That contains a finite verb, that's a finite verb. And so one distinction that would need to be made on this question is, do we want a finite verb or not? Turns out that we do, because this sentence here otherwise would lack a finite verb. And so we've got to choose one of those 2. Then we have to make the distinction between what remains. These things have approached or they approach. Well, there's no subject-verb agreement error there, and so the distinction between B and C is going to be a matter of verb tense, and in this case, we just want to keep it in the simple present tense. It's something that they do each year. And so that would be an example of a question that, involves two distinctions. The distinction between non-finite and finite, and the distinction between simple present and present perfect. But I'll talk more about the perfects and that stuff in another video, just as I'll talk more about finite and non-finite and subject-verb agreement. But again, this is just meant to be a broad overview of what you're usually going to encounter and maybe what you might possibly encounter in the future if they decide to start mixing things up.